Today on the episode, we're really pleased to be joined by two very prominent psychologists. We have Dr. Helen Wakeling, who's a research psychologist, and Dr. Georgia Barnett, who's a forensic psychologist, and both of whom have worked for His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service for over 20 years before leaving and setting up their own research and consultancy business. Between them, they have over 80 publications across a range of topics and using a wide range of methodologies, including, which is very difficult to do in a prison setting, for random controlled trials. Both are evidence-based specialists specialising in translating complex research and theory into concrete actions and helping people to know what to do in their work in an evidence-based way. They've started a consultancy business called KTA Research and Consulting, and so they'll talk to us about that. So this episode we'll think about what that was, the different areas of research that they've both taken part in, and then how we can improve our research skills. And I was thinking about how when you ask your favourite band, where did your name come from? Maybe you could tell us, where did your name come from?
Yeah, it stands for knowledge to action, because
Okay.
we're applied psychologists. We want to help bring evidence into practice where it can make a difference to people every day. And right now, I think we absolutely appreciate the need to have big picture thinkers, philosophers, academics, people with better brains than ours, to question and to shift paradigms. But our focus really is on how we can get that well-supported theory, findings from really robust empirical research to guide what people do in criminal justice settings in the here and now.
We always start our episodes with asking people how they started, how they got into forensic psychology. So, Georgia, could you start? Could you tell us about your pathway into forensic psychology, please?
Yes. I'm one of those slightly annoying people who knew from quite an early age what I wanted to be. So I knew that I wanted to be a psychologist pretty much from the time I hit secondary school. I think I've always been really interested in understanding people, in understanding how they think, why people behave in the way that they do. And I've always been a big fan of psychological thrillers. I really loved watching those sorts of films and reading those sorts of books as a teenager. And I became really curious then about what professionals in forensic settings actually did in real life. So what that looked like, what it meant to work with people who commit crime. So I went on to study psychology at university, and I got a job in a secure unit at a hospital. And I was working with people with enduring mental health problems who'd committed serious crimes. And I was a support worker. So I spent a lot of time talking to the residents there. And I just found that what really interested me was understanding why they'd committed the crimes they'd committed, and sort of working with them to help find ways that they could build a better life for themselves, to think about reintegration, which was a really big ask of people who'd been in institutions for a long time. And then during my time at the hospital, I saw an advert and I applied for a job for an assistant psychologist in a prison. And because that really brought those two things together, it just seemed like the perfect job. And I got the job and I absolutely loved it. I was working in a category B prison, mainly with men convicted of sexual offences and those who were serving life sentences. And I applied for a job as a trainee at the same prison on the apprenticeship route. And that funded me then to do a master's in forensic psychology while I was working. So I was doing that part-time while I was working at the prison. And then about halfway through my training, I moved into a job in headquarters in a research role. And then I qualified in around, I think it was 2009, and went on to do a variety of different things after that.
And Helen, would you mind telling us about your roots into this strange world we all work in?
Yeah, sure. So I wasn't like Georgia. I did not know what I wanted to do when I was younger. But I did go to university. I was interested in psychology, so I did a undergraduate degree at Leeds University. And then after I graduated, I had a bit of a sliding doors moment because I was applying for lots of different jobs and I got offered two jobs at the same time. One was with a mental health charity, and the other one was as a psych assistant at HMPPS headquarters. So they were quite different, and I did kind of and ah about which one to take, but in the end I obviously went for the HMPPS job. And essentially I haven't really looked back since. So when I got a role in what was back then called Offending Behaviour Programmes Unit, it's now called Interventions Services. But I got a role as a psychological assistant. And part of my role as a psych assistant was conducting research as well as managing the assessment processes for programs kind of run and delivered in prisons and probation nationally. And being involved in that research kind of made me realise that my passion was really in research. Up until that point, I kind of knew I had an interest in the forensic field, but I didn't really know whether I was going to go down a clinical route or a research route. But being involved in that research really solidified that that's what I wanted to do. And so after being in that role for a few years, I passed an assessment board to become a trainee psychologist and then moved upwards from there. But essentially staying in positions which were primarily research focused. I undertook a part-time master's in social research methods and psychology, and then later also did a PhD, both while being employed by HMPPS. So the route to become, so I'm a chartered research psychologist, but work in the forensic field. But the route to chartership is slightly different to the route to a forensic psychologist chartership. So I had to provide a kind of portfolio of evidence of my research experience and publications. And because I've been involved in a number of different research projects throughout my employment and published in academic journals, I was successful when I applied for chartership at that point.
I love asking these questions. We learn so much about different ways that people got in, and I think it's really important for other people who are listening and thinking about how to get into the world, how they can, different options they have. And also, you can always guarantee that somebody's going to mention a psychological thriller or a sliding doors moment, so you don't hit those.
Excellent.
Cliches the go-go.
So could you tell us about some of the research you did at HMPPS?
Yeah, so we've both been involved, both Georgia and I have been involved in a range of research at HMPPS over the years. So early in both of our careers, so when Georgia joined HMPPS and when I got my first job, we were both focused on research around interventions delivered across prison and probation. So conducted research around, people's experiences of taking part in programs or interventions in prisons and probation. We touched on the kind of research around the effectiveness of programs, as well as the reliability and validity of assessments and risk assessment tools that are used within HMPPS. More latterly and at different times, we both ended up in a central team called the Evidence-Based Practice Team, whose remit is really to bring evidence into frontline practice. So we worked closely with prisons and probation and youth custody service. But when we came into that role, our research remit kind of broadened quite a bit. So instead of just being focused on interventions, it became much broader. So I have done quite a bit of research around, for example, substance misuse in prisons, desistance from crime. I've done quite a bit of work around young adults, around psychosocial maturity, learning disability and challenges, as well as kind of prison culture. So in the last few years before I left HMPPS, I was doing quite a lot of work around what we can do to improve the culture in our prisons and kind of developed a model of culture change as well. And Georgia has focused on different topics, but she has focused more on kind of women, young adults, staff well-being, how we manage behaviour in prisons, bias in decision making, and also how we can create a diverse and inclusive organisational culture. But one of the things, so we've worked together for a number of years, Georgia and I, and one of the things I guess that we're most proud of, and which you talked about Jerry, in the introduction, was that we have designed and delivered 4 randomized control trials in criminal justice settings, which are kind of the gold standard of research design, and which are notoriously difficult to execute in a forensic setting. So we're really quite proud of that. So yeah, a real range of different research. We've been quite lucky to be involved in a range of different research projects and have really enjoyed it.
Why is it important for interventions to have evidence of being effective?
Yeah, I think there are several really important reasons. I think, first of all, we really want to give ourselves the best chance of success. As forensic psychologists, we're scientist practitioners, aren't we? So it's our job to apply the very best evidence to what we do, because that's a way of ensuring that we're learning not only from our experience, but the experience of millions of other people as well, so that we can apply and use those interventions that are most likely to bring about the outcomes that we're interested in for the people that we're working with. And that's, whether that's people working in or in contact with forensic settings, so staff, people in prison, people on probation, survivors of crime, or the public. And I think, sort of relatedly, sort of the other side of the coin, another really important reason is that even interventions that are based on the strongest theories that we have, they have the potential to do harm. So there are plenty of examples of interventions that on the surface seem great. So they might be based on sound psychological theory, they might be delivered by people who really care about the outcomes. They might look like they're doing what we want them to do because there are success stories, there are testimonials, there are people who are invested in successful outcomes of those programs. The people doing the hard work feel that it makes a difference. But actually, when you look at longer term, more objective, more reliable measures of success, then actually you see that there are examples where interventions have actually done the opposite. They've done harm. And I think Scared Straight is a really good example of that. So these are interventions that worked with young people who were thought to be at risk of ending up in prison. And the idea was that they would be brought into a prison environment to be given the prison experience in order to deter them from committing crime. So in order to kind of scare them straight, as the name would suggest. And the people who were involved in setting this up, which was often sort of police officers, prison officers, absolutely were doing it for the right reasons, really wanted to help people who looked like they might be on a kind of offending trajectory. The people who went through it were often saying, wow, okay, that was a really emotional experience. That's really opened my eyes. I absolutely don't want to end up in prison. Often they'd make the kind of conditions in prison seem particularly harsh in order to build up that kind of deterrent effect. But actually, when there was really robust research looking at the people who'd been through those programs and comparing them with people who hadn't been through those programs, but who had very similar characteristics, actually they saw that the people who went through the programs were more likely to end up committing crime. And I think that's, it's a salutary tale, isn't it? It's on the surface of it, Scared Straight is something that there's a rationale behind it, that you might be able to kind of build people's motivation not to engage in crime. But actually, that's a faulty theory of change, because motivation isn't the only thing that you need in order not to do something harmful or not to do something which might, harm yourself as well as other people, because motivation is dynamic. But also just building motivation doesn't lead to those sort of longer term deep shifts in thinking. It doesn't build capability to do things differently. It doesn't help people to develop new skills. It doesn't give people opportunities to live a different kind of life. It doesn't deal with any of the wider issues that people are grappling with, like poverty, like addiction, like living with the after effects of trauma. So I think Scared Straight is just a good example of how there can be things that on the surface of it look like they might be a good idea, have all the best intentions in the world, sort of passionate, committed people with hearts in the right places doing it. But in that case, that had a kind of theory a sort of a faulty theory of change, sorry. In other cases, it might be that you have, you know, an intervention that is designed on a theory of change that actually is really sound and really in keeping with our understanding of how and why people engage in different sorts of behaviours or behaviour change. But actually, it might be that it simply can't be implemented in the way that it needs to be implemented to work in the particular setting or with the particular group that you're trying to work with. And unless we evaluate it, unless we collect and examine the evidence of impact on outcomes, we won't know that. So we can have the best intentions, but we can still engage in harmful practices. So I think ethically, it's really important. But I also think a commitment to a kind of evaluation, building the evidence base around interventions is also really important. We've got that duty to do no harm, and that means learning from mistakes, from interventions that have been proven not to work or that make things worse for people. So we have a responsibility to know and apply the evidence about what doesn't work as well as what does. And actually, I had a colleague, Flora Fitz-Allen-Howard, wrote a paper on that topic where we brought together the findings from various interventions that had been evaluated, that had an evidence base, and there was some demonstration that either they had no impact on the outcomes that they were intending to impact on, or they made things worse, and sort of trying to learn some lessons from that. So it's really important that we commit to evaluating interventions and that we use the evidence from those evaluations and bring that into our practice. Yeah, I think there's also something about making sure that we understand what's effective for whom and under what conditions and why as well. So it's about helping us to build our knowledge and understanding of kind of mechanisms of change of different interventions, which is really important. And that's not to say that to work in a kind of in an evidence-informed way or to strive towards working in an evidence-based way means that we shouldn't try new things, or that we should stifle innovation and only do things that have a very sort of secure evidence base, because then you just end up doing things which tend to be easier to evaluate, for example, and it's harder to move things forward, or to move things forward quickly, maybe. But I think what we do need to do, we need to assure ourselves that there's a solid rationale that's rooted in theory behind the interventions that we deliver. And we need to commit to really careful monitoring of the outcomes of those interventions, and to being open to the idea that we can do harm, to monitoring for adverse reactions, measuring those intended outcomes, to build that evidence base to help us be more effective in bringing about those outcomes that we're aiming to. And, you know, we live in a world of limited resources, and we want to make what we do count. We want to get best value for money. We don't want to waste money on things that don't work or don't do what they intend to do. So I think that's probably another reason. But I will probably stop now, because I will spend the whole time talking about it.
That was really useful, thank you. So in this past year, you've left, we should say HMPPS is obviously His Majesty's now prison service and probation. And so you started this private practice. So you could tell us, like, who were the people you would consult to in that private practice?
So yeah, a range of people really. So much of the work that we've been doing so far since we've set up KTA has been for the Ministry of Justice, but we've also worked for other departments such as the HMIP, the Probation Inspectorate, the Youth Custody Service, and also some of the private companies who run prisons. And we've done some work for the NHS. So it were kind of very much within the criminal justice space, but you know, quite a wide variety of people. We're also currently working with a very small company who've designed and are delivering courses in prisons to build motivation and teach skills to prisoners around setting up their own business. And we're helping them with an evaluation strategy for their work. So it's a wide variety of different people that we'll be working with, but essentially we can work with anyone who is looking for research to be conducted, or training to be done, or consultancy, or indeed kind of evidence-based practice generally, but our expertise, obviously, and our main interest is in the criminal justice space. So we're really keen to continue working with prisons and with probation and youth justice kind of going forward. That's where our passion lies, and that's where we want to continue to try to make a difference.
Kind of always assumed private practice was people conducting assessments for people or being expert witnesses, but to know that you are doing something, you know, in the research field and also just, you know, broadening our skills as psychologists, I think that's really cool.
Yeah, it's quite different from the traditional way people do private practice, I think.
Yeah, and it's good again to see that there is such a range of things you can do, and it sounds you've got a really good broad range of different pieces of work to do, which sounds very interesting to spread your knowledge as well and develop your skills. So, as we've mentioned before, Emily was an early career award winner at the DFP, and you two were very well-deserved excellent in research prize from the Division of Forensic Psychology. So congratulations to both. So what does that sort of award mean to you?
It means a lot. Yeah, thank you. We were really honoured and privileged to win that award for doing research, which is the thing that we love doing. So it was a real, privilege to receive that award. I think particularly, I think we both feel that research is such a critical part of forensic psychology, and will ultimately kind of progress the field and progress where forensic psychology goes. So without research, we will be a bit stifled. So we need to have really good and robust research conducted. And I also really believe in the importance of feeding research kind of feeding back into practice and policy and making an impact on the ground. That's what I really love to see. And I think that's why we're both so passionate about doing research and why we were so honoured to get this award. But we also recognise that doing good research and being recognised in this way is, down to a lot of the people that we've been working with. So doing good research is really about collaboration, and it's really about teamwork, and it's getting the support that you need to do good research. And we have both been very lucky to have worked with, excellent colleagues and had people to kind of guide us and inspire us to be where we are today. And I think without that, we wouldn't be where we are now. So it's thanks to them, really, some key people. But also it's, doing research in prisons is difficult. Doing research in probation is difficult. And it's thanks to the people out there doing the work who have a real passion and commitment, and enable us to do the research that makes this happen. And it's thanks to them as well. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, that's really nice. At the award acceptance event, you spoke about implementation science. Please, could you tell us what that is?
Yes, absolutely. I'll take this in as well, Georgia. So yeah, implementation science is really focused on the things that are important for a service or intervention to be implemented well. So you could have a really fantastic, brilliantly designed intervention based on the best available evidence of what works. But if there are issues with implementation, then it's unlikely to reach its kind of maximum potential to change outcomes. So we know that there's a gap between how interventions are designed to be delivered and how they're actually delivered on the ground. An implementation science provides a helpful way of identifying the particular areas which can increase the likelihood that we will deliver an intervention to succeed in the aims that intervention has. So there are a number of different kind of models that are within the implementation science, but one of the best well known is called the CFIR, the Consolidated Framework of Implementation Research. And that model suggests that there are a number of different domains which are really important in terms of implementing something well. So it depends on things around the setting in which you're delivering the intervention. That's really important. The inner setting, so the people around the service is really important. The outer setting is also really important. So the wider kind of culture, the wider political influences around that intervention and service are important. As well as that, you've got the characteristics of the people involved in the intervention. So you've got the people delivering it, you've got the recipients, and you've got the leaders as well. They're also really key in supporting good implementation. And then you've got kind of other factors sitting alongside that. So some of the processes and strategies that are used to kind of implement the innovation or intervention, and whether kind of those are sufficient. So essentially, there are a number of different domains, a number of different factors that are really critical for implementing something well. And what we've learned from research and what we've learned from conducting research that we've done is that implementation really matters. It's not just the thing that's being delivered, but it's how it's being delivered that's really important. So for example, if there's a lack of leadership support for an intervention, then it's not going to be as effective as an intervention that did have leadership support. So if that critical factor is missing, that is going to have an impact on how well that intervention achieves its aims. So essentially, yeah, implementation science is something that we've got much more knowledge about in the last few years, myself and Georgia, but we really understand now that it's critical for doing a good job and making sure that interventions are as successful as they can be.
So if someone came to you and said, I'd like you to evaluate this program, but the effectiveness of this program, but they hadn't considered how they were implementing it, would your advice be, yeah, this is how you would evaluate how effective it is, and also we would advise you to look at this model to think about the implementation of it as well?
I think so. I think in an ideal world, you would want to look at the implementation factors as well to see if they are in place, or what challenges are in place around implementation that might be affecting how successful that intervention is. Yeah, absolutely.
Nice, I like it.
Really in depth, isn't it? And you also mentioned at your speech about being a psychological engineer. And when I was at school, I went to an all-girls school and I said I wanted to be an engineer, and I was told no, girls can't do that. So I'm quite excited to think I might be one. I didn't even know. So could you tell us what a psychological engineer is?
Oh, well, I've got good news, Jerry. You are definitely a psychological engineer.
I'll add that to my
Congratulations.
CV. My work here is done.
Yeah, it's a great term, isn't it? It was, so I first came across it when I was reading Jeffrey Cohen and David Yeager's work. So they're two social psychologists in the US, and a lot of their work has been around educational outcomes. They've done some really incredible studies. They're my kind of professional crushes, because they've designed really carefully, really sort of methodically, just these beautiful studies in schools to understand the precise psychological mechanisms that influence educational achievement for different groups of students. And they talk about how important it is when you're developing and testing interventions to involve a professional who understands the theoretical underpinnings of the intervention, but also the contextual challenges to implementation. If you understand the theory behind the intervention, so if you really understand the theory of change, then you can make the necessary adjustments to the design or to implementation that take into account those constraints of the context within which you're working, but that also keep that theory of change intact, that remain faithful to the theory of change. They don't affect how likely the intervention is to work. So you maintain those sort of key ingredients so you can engineer a solution based on that underlying understanding of what it is you're trying to achieve, how and why, and the conditions necessary for psychological change. So yeah, that's a psychological engineer, someone who can apply their understanding of psychology to the kind of the development and the ongoing kind of iterations of interventions to bring about psychological change in a way that really fits in a real world context. So something that, you know, brings together what we've been talking about and very appealing to us. So yeah, I love that term.
You also mentioned applying for funds for research. So how does that work? Would that work in the way you are now in your role, or would that have been something you were doing while you were employed at HMPPS?
Yeah, both actually. And I think it's something that as a profession, we probably don't make best use of, because there are different ways to access different pots of funding. So in the Ministry of Justice, there's the Innovations Fund, which we tapped into to develop and trial an intervention for women who were serving short sentences in prison. And that funding, that paid for an officer for a year to manage and run the intervention on site. And it paid for the support of an independent psychologist who came in on a monthly basis, oversaw the kind of clinical integrity of the intervention as it went along, and also the kind of the trial protocol. And so we did that when we were in HMPPS. You know, so if you have ideas, if you've got an idea about something, you spot a gap, you think there's something actually here that I'd really like to trial because there's this psychological theory over here, or this sort of burgeoning evidence base which says that doing this kind of thing could make a difference to this outcome, and actually I think it could really work here. There is money available to help you realize that idea and to help properly test it, which I think is really exciting. And then there are other ways of kind of accessing funding. So I think universities are often looking for people with practical experience, people who sort of fill the gaps in the experience within their departments sometimes, people who can help facilitate access to forensic populations and understand what the key areas of research interest are in an applied setting. So I think linking up with academics who are involved in areas of research that you're interested in, that are related to your particular field of expertise or the work that you're doing, that's a really great way to access funding from some of the big research councils, like the Economics and Social Research Council or the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and then organisations like UKRI. So you can actually work with academics, become part of a group of people who are applying for funding to do research in these areas. And then there are charities, organisations in the third sector who apply for grants, and some of those grants are contingent on having some sort of evaluation in place. So you can, there are absolutely opportunities to kind of collaborate with charities to help them to access funding, as well as to secure funding to do research and evaluation kind of, with charities, which is an evidence base that's often it's often lacking, because charities don't always have the right experience in-house to develop a proper evaluation strategy, particularly the smaller charities, and so that it's just a gap that I think forensic psychologists are actually really well placed to be able to fill and take on that psychological engineer role. So yeah, there are a variety of different ways that you can access different pots of funding to do research.
When you're describing the research and the applying for funding for it, is sort of like, to me, like another depth of a layer of, we've sort of done pieces of research but not gone to this step, because I've found even writing an application for a research grant is another language as well that you have to learn, learn the keywords and what's likely to, you have to do almost a lot of research to know what's this grant, what are they likely to fund, what are the words that sort of gel with them. It is a whole, I think working with somebody who's done it before is really important, isn't it? Because they know that language.
They do, and I think you learn so much. I think in terms of professional development, tapping into different people with different perspectives, and different networks as well. I think it's a great thing for everyone involved, really.
And you spoke of the use of prototyping. Can you tell us what that is? I mean, we feel like the whole other language here tonight on our episode tonight. We learned a lot of different skills.
Yeah, so prototyping is Well, it's something that it's really exciting, actually. It's a really exciting approach that hasn't traditionally been used in forensic psychology or certainly within HMPPS, but it is slowly gaining momentum and has done in the last kind of few years. So prototyping is a way of developing, testing, and improving ideas at an early stage, which is kind of low cost and low risk. So the approach places real emphasis on kind of quick iterative learning, quick iterative testing of ideas to help provide insight, to generate learning, and then to inform kind of development of ideas or interventions at an early stage. So it's a much quicker pace than traditional research, and it adopts a kind of flexible approach. It's a learning approach to try out new models and systems, and it's also about not being afraid to stop something if it's not working, or make changes to a system or an intervention or the thing that you're working with to improve it and then refine it again as you go forward. So I think a lot of organisations, certainly probably HMPPS, we need to have a greater emphasis on innovation and a greater emphasis on trying out new approaches without having a fear of repercussion or a fear of blame if things don't work out. And I think that's what prototyping offers. It offers a way of doing that and testing out ideas at really quick pace that helps us learn, and we don't have to wait kind of years for an evaluation to kind of be conducted and published to learn. So it's a much faster pace of learning things. Like quick learning, reflecting and modifying as you go. And we've used prototyping in one of the randomized control trials that we have conducted in prisons, and it was a really good way of feeding back learning to the prison in a really quick manner. So yeah, that's really what it's about, quick learning and iterative process.
So is it very similar to a pilot study, or how is it different from a pilot study?
It's kind of different because you do more modification as you go. So if you've got a prototype, like a system that you've put in place, if throughout, like after a month of kind of delivering that, and you realize that something's not quite working, you would then tweak it at that point rather than waiting at the end of the pilot evaluation and then writing about the fact that that didn't work. You would change it as you go and then modifying it and keep reflecting on that. So you're kind of doing the change as part of the process rather than waiting to the end, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting, 'cause I've got to the end of research and recommended things. I thought, why didn't I do that when I was doing it?
Well, exactly. So this is about making those changes as you go.
Yeah, oh, that's really good. And then I guess you write it up in a way of explaining why you're doing that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
It's very exciting. All these new methods we're learning today.
So what about the future? Where is the future taking you both?
I think we see ourselves doing more work with people who've been in prison or who've been managed by probation or supervised by probation, and who want to kind of give back, who want to use their experience to help other people. We're really keen on using the evidence base to support people to be able to achieve those kind of outcomes. Whether that's about helping get people into jobs, helping people's well-being, providing a support network for people who wouldn't otherwise have one. It's about kind of supporting people with lived experience of the criminal justice system to be able to be as effective as they can be if they've chosen to go into a criminal justice setting and set up a service. I think that's something that we all feel really passionate about. We definitely want to keep on developing and adding to the evidence base, so there will be more published research on its way. We're doing some work with universities, so we've been linking up with academics on some projects, which has been really exciting. And we're going to be helping the Welsh Government to understand the requirements for devolution of justice, which is also a really interesting project. And I think another thing that we want to do, sort of this is the near future, something that we haven't had as much of a chance to do over the last year as we had in the kind of decade prior, is to do more training. It was such a staple of our working lives for such a long time, delivering all sorts of training to get people excited about the evidence as applies to their particular role, to help them understand how to do things that are really in line with evidence, how to become curious and start to collect evidence themselves, to start to test things out. And I think we've done some over the last year, but we would really like to do more of that, because I think we always feel really energized, and we really feel like we're actively contributing something of value when we deliver training. And I think people who work in criminal justice are such a diverse and passionate and values driven, innovative bunch of people, and we'd like to spend more time with them and harness that passion and energy and help to direct it into practices that are likely to make the differences that we all want to see. So we'd like to do more of that.
And I'm sure you spend more time in a more sort of in that sort of setting. People will come up with ideas and think we can, they're sort of freed up a bit in that sort of setting to come up with lots of different ideas, and people that might not have met with you before, if it is the people that are running the interventions that are thinking, well, I've always thought you should do it like this, and they've never said it. So yeah, I can imagine that would be really useful.
Yeah, I should also say that it was a big jump for us to actually move away from HMPPS and set up KTA. It was a really big decision for us. So it's myself, Georgia, and another colleague called Flora Fitzalan-Howard. It's the three of us who are now KTA. But it was, a big move, because we all, firmly our identity was around being a public servant, and that was kind of our whole careers was around that. But what we wanted was to kind of, I think, to take up the opportunity to widen the people that we work with and have the opportunity to do different things. And I think we've realised that in the past year since we've set up that there's lots of different things out there, and we're exploring different avenues, and it's really exciting. And it's kind of opened up the door to us to a whole different world, which is scary but also very exciting.
Thank you so much for joining us on the episode today, and all that is left for us to say is let's talk forensic psychology.